All right, let's get underway with Joshua chapters 1 and 2. Let's do some introductory information on the book of Joshua, which is always important to know the book that we're studying and what it's about and how it fits with everything else. So we will get to our questions, perhaps at times. We won't always cover our questions. We're not going to throw the class open as we often do. But if you don't fill out the questions, that's fine. If you'll read chapters that are slated and read through those, the questions, or if you need some help guiding you through that study, we may or may not get to the questions. So don't worry too hard about if you get stumped on a question. Anyway, let's talk about who this book is about. The book is named because of the chief character, not because of the author, though he probably is the author. What do we know about Joshua? Well, he seems to be the author of the book. He's an author of a portion of the book, if not all of the book. If he is the author of the book, then the record of his death was penned by someone else later, so there had to be at least two people involved in the writing of the book. Joshua 24:26 says Joshua wrote these words in the book of the law of God. Did that mean he wrote every word? Well, I don't think he wrote the part down here about the bones, about his death. So that had to be penned after his death. So it may not be saying he wrote the whole portion of that. Some argue that he didn't write the book and he's just the chief character. That's not greatly important, I don't think, as to whether we know he wrote the book. But he wrote some portion of it at least. Now, the name was Hosea, which means salvation. Moses changed it to Joshua, which means Jehovah is salvation. And when translated into Greek, it's the same term for the term Jesus, which means Savior. And there were a number of people named Jesus. That was not unique to the Messiah. Jesus of Nazareth, that's why we call him Jesus of Nazareth. There were other Jesus around, other people who would wear the name Jesus. But that name change is found in Numbers 13 in verse 16. He was Moses' minister or Moses' assistant. He's called that in our chapter tonight, chapter 1 and in verse 1. He'd led in the battle against the Amalekites in Exodus chapter 17. He was one of the two spies that was sent into the land that came back with a positive report. Remember, most of them came back with a negative report, but the two that had a positive report, and Joshua and Caleb was the other. Josephus and tradition, which means we have no scripture, that tells us this, but both say that he was 85 at the time of the conquest. And so some of our interpretation of the dating about how long this book covers is based upon that. He died at 110, we do know, according to chapter 24 and verse 29. So that's what we know about Joshua now, the man, the chief character of the book. Let's talk about the theme of the book. What is the book about? Well, the book is about the conquest and the dividing of the land of Canaan. And that is this land that we'll give reference to this time and again in the conquest. But this is after it's all been divided, and the tribes. And so here we have the 12 tribes that have as the land is divided. And so you have there Judah and Ephraim and Benjamin and Dan and Manasseh and on down the line. 3 tribes or 2.5 tribes were on the east side of the river. We'll talk about those this evening. But to give you kind of a perspective of the size of that, we blow that up and make that large. And this scale right over here tells us that scale is about 50 miles. So this is not a large area. Compared to the United States, this shaded area right here represents modern Israel, not necessarily the exact borderline of ancient Israel of the 12 tribes, but it's close. So that's modern Israel by comparison to the United States, and you have Tennessee there as a comparison. So we're not talking about a large area. We're not talking about something the size of North America, obviously. This is a very small region that they were going to conquer. Now, this is the first of the historical books. Books are arranged by subject matter. The first 5, though they are historical, obviously, Genesis 1 is historical, Genesis 2 is historical, and all the way through to the end of the book. Numbers is historical, so is Exodus historical. But those were books of law, and so they're grouped together because they primarily focus on the law. But starting in Joshua through the book of Esther is the history. Everything else fits in, the rest of the Old Testament fits into that period. So all of these prophets that we've been talking about, and we'll talk about in the future, all fit into that time period of this history, and this begins that history section. But actually it is a continuation of the Pentateuch and proceeds with national history. The last thing that we saw, now we've taken some time after closing of Deuteronomy till we pick up with Joshua, but the last scene we had, they've been mourning for 30 days on the death of Moses. Moses has died, and they've been mourning for 30 days, and at the end of that, Joshua picks up, and God's ready for them to march on and take over the land. Now, there are two major points. This is not the outline we're going to follow, but watch for two major things that are going to happen. And if you see these two themes in the book, then you've got the message of the book of Joshua. The two major points in the book is the conquest of the land. That's the first 12 chapters. So for the first 12, we're going to have them marching across the river, chapters 1 to 5. And then from that point on, then there's the conquest of the land. And so there is going to be a campaign through the middle. There's going to be a campaign to the south and a campaign to the north. We're going to talk about those various campaigns. And then there is the division of the land, dividing it into which tribe gets which portion. And so that's basically the point of the book. Now let's talk about the time frame that it covers. It covers about 25 years. And that's assuming that Josephus and tradition is right, that he was about 85 years old. And so when you're convinced otherwise, then take those numbers and change them to fit that. I'm not going to argue about that. So if he died at 110 and the conquest is about 85, which is where the book opens up, then we're covering about 25 years in the book. It covers from the death of Moses to the death of Joshua. And so what year do we put the death of Moses? Various chronologists give it different dates. I often quote from Klassen. I like Klassen's chronology, not that I think he's got the corner on chronology. Erdman puts the conquest about 1240, but Klassen puts it at 1423. I'll leave that to you. The first 12 chapters took about 5 to 7 years. That is the conquest itself. The other 18 to 20 years was the settlement. It took longer to settle and to take care of some problem areas. We'll talk about that. And also to divide the land and to who gets what portion and so what tribe was going where. Took about 18 to 20 years. So that's the time frame we're looking at with reference to the book. Now let's look at an outline of the book. In my mind, an outline is always important. I often borrow major outlines, not chapter outlines, but major outlines from Wiersbe or Baxter One. And this time I like Wiersbe here. By the way, if you follow Wiersbe, and some of you do, some of you tell me you've got Wiersbe stuff, depending on which book you're following. In his big book of outlines, it will be one outline. He'll give an entirely different one in his commentary. This is in his big book. But nonetheless, he made three major sections, and I like the way he's presented this, of the book of Joshua. There's the crossing of the river, chapters 1 to 5, the conquering of the enemy, 6 to 12, and then there's the claiming of the inheritance, 13 to 24. And so we're focusing on chapters 1 to 5. We're going to see the commission to Joshua. We'll see the covenant with Rahab. He always makes these things agreeable, that is, in his lettering and in his rhythm of outline, as I would call it. The crossing of the Jordan, chapters 3 and 4, we'll see next time, and the circumcision at Gilgal. That's what we're going to be focused on. Commission of Joshua and the covenant with Rahab. We'll come back to that. To get a taste of where we're going, in the next section of the book, we're going to talk about the central campaign, the southern campaign, and the northern campaign. So they went into the middle, then went to the south, then went to the north. And then the kings that they defeated, chapter 12. So then there's the claiming of the land. There was the tribal territory that was assigned, the special cities appointed, like the cities of refuge, the priestly cities, the border tribes were allotted, and the entire nation was admonished. So that gets into more the settlement for the 18 to 20 years in the last section of the book. All right, let's go to our questions. We will pay attention to some of the questions. We will not take the time each time to rehearse chapter titles, but I hope you'll remember those, because that'll help you, as we do with other books, to remember a chapter title and put a title to it that you think best, but something that summarizes that chapter. So question number one is a short summary of Joshua 1. Well, a short summary would be the chapter title, Joshua Prepares for Conquest. He's getting ready and God's preparing him. Now let's see what happens here in this conquest or in this preparation in chapter 1. There's some very practical things that we're going to get to. particularly when we get to question number 4 and 5 here in just a second. All right? Let's talk about the first 9 verses. Joshua was chosen to succeed Moses. Moses was the leader. He's dead. And quite often when a leader dies, the question is, who's going to lead us now? If you have Wiersbe's commentary on Joshua, his whole chapter 1 is about leadership. And in leadership, he makes the observation that leaders need to be preparing for new leaders in the future because leaders don't lead forever. Moses couldn't be their leader forever, nor can Joshua be their leader forever. Leaders die, so new leaders need to be coming along all the time. Good practical thing to learn from that. Let's talk about verses 1 to 9 now. What we have beginning at verse 1, that after the death of Moses, God came to Moses' assistant. Verse 2 now, he said, "My servant Moses is dead, therefore rise and go over the Jordan, you and all the people, to the land that I am giving you." There's a promise. Come back to that promise. Verse 3, "Every place in which you'll set your foot, I have given to you, as I said Moses." I promised it to Abraham. I promised it to Moses, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and on down the line. And I also promised it through Moses. Just as I told Moses, I'm going to give it to you as well. Now look at verses 4 and 5. From the wilderness, he tells the region, and the region is pictured here. What he's doing is telling this is the region that is in the darker shade. That from the great river Euphrates to the land of the Hittites to the great sea toward the going down of the sun shall be your territory. Now verse 5, "No man will be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, I will be with you and I'll not forsake you. I was with Moses bringing you through the wilderness. I'll be with you in the conquering of this land. This is the territory that you will receive." So that's all he said down to verse 5. Now I want to go ahead and get through verse 9, then we're going to come to some questions and make some practical things, I hope. God's instruction to him is, "Be strong and of good courage." It's interesting to me, and as a footnote here, that's a command of God. He doesn't just say, "I hope you are going to be strong. I know you can't help it. And I hope you are courageous. I know you can't help whether or not you lose courage. I know you can't help it, but I hope that's the way it is." That's not what God said. God said, "Be strong." That's a command. "And be of good courage." Be courageous. Command. You can be courageous if you put your mind to it, is the point I'm learning from that. "Be strong and of good courage. For to this people you shall divide as an inheritance, the land that I swore to give to them." Here again in verse 7, "Only be strong and very courageous," he said, "that you might do according to all that's written in the law." Now come back to that in a moment. "That your hand may prosper wherever you go." Trying to get through to verse 9, and then we're going to summarize. "The book of the law shall not depart out of your mouth. You'll meditate on it day and night, that you may observe to do all that is written in the book, and then your way will be prosperous, and you'll have good success." We have a question about success on question 4. And then verse 9, "Have I not commanded you be strong and of good courage, and I'll be with you wherever you go." All right, now let's start and talk about what we just saw. Let's go to question 4 to start with. Find a biblical definition, and that should be a quotation. Typo there. Actually, it was a conversion problem of coming out of another version of Microsoft Word. But nonetheless, find a biblical definition of success. All right? Here is a biblical definition of being a success. One is be strong. Be strong. If you're not strong, it's not talking about physical strength, because that's not how they're depending on conquering the land. This is not physical strength. This is spiritual strength. Be strong, he said. He mentioned it at verse 6, verse 7, verse 9. And all 3 times he said it as a command. It's actually mentioned another time, but we'll talk about it in a moment. It's not actually from God. Verse 6, verse 7, verse 9. Be strong. Be courageous. Very courageous. Verse 6, verse 7, verse 9. 3 times God told, in 9 verses, God told Joshua, you need to be strong, you need to be courageous. Now, I'm going to come back to courageous. Let's go on and finish this. Meditate on the law. Look at verse 9, verse 8. The book of the law shall not depart out of your mouth. You shall meditate on it day and night. Then he goes on to talk about obedience. So there's the knowledge of the law, but that's not meditation. There's the obedience to the law. That's not meditation. Meditation is something else. Meditation is reflecting on what you have heard, what you have learned, and what you know. Even though you are doing it or about to do it or going to do that. Not all commands are you carrying out at the very moment. So reflect on that. What does it mean to meditate? Well, you're going to think about what God has said. What does that mean? How do I apply? Where does that fit? How do I fulfill that? God said, be strong. How am I going to be strong? And so meditating might be, I might read this passage about be strong and be of good courage. I might stop and reflect and meditate. How do I be strong? What does God mean by be strong? When I feel like I'm not strong, how do I change that? That's meditation. I'm thinking and reflecting and making application of that. And then he says, and that should say 7 and 8, verses 7 and 8, to obey that. Go back to verse 7. That you may observe to do the law. No, do all the law. That's the same thing Moses had been preaching for 30 days prior to this 30 days of mourning. So they're just about 2 months away from hearing those sermons, those 4 sermons about obedience and doing all that is written in the law. 30 days hadn't passed, hardly, or about 30 days have passed. Now verse 8, the book shall not depart out of your mouth, and you meditate on it day and night, and that you may observe to do according to all that is written in it. And then your way will be prosperous and you'll have good success. So here's the key to success right here. Be strong, be courageous, meditate on the law and obey it. Now let's go back to being strong and courageous and go back to the context now, and let's talk about sources of courage and sources of strength. This is part of meditation now. What would be a source of courage? What would be a source of strength? So you say, I want to be courageous. I feel like I've got a task before me that's as monumental as conquering the land of Canaan where Joshua's leading. I've got responsibility of leading, and it's just, in my mind, just as tough as Joshua's job, and God said, be courageous. What was his source of courage? Well, let's go to the context and see. First of all, is it verse 2, God's appointment. God's appointment. What do you mean? Because God had appointed that to him, that should give him courage. God said, you can do it. You're the man. You see, if God has commanded you to do something or told you to do something or appointed you to do something, God's saying you can do it. If God gave you a job as a husband, God's saying you can do that. I've appointed you to do that. You've got God's appointment. If you've got some responsibilities as a wife, you say, I don't know if I can do that, or as a mother or as a father, I'm not sure about this. You can do it because God has appointed you to do that. So first of all is God's appointment. Secondly is God's promise. What was God's promise? Well, look at verse 3 and 4. I'm giving you the land. How can I know that this is going to work, going across and going to come? Because God said, I'm giving it to you. Verse 5, still part of the promise. God said, I'll defeat your enemies. So one of the things that gives us courage is to rely on God's promises. For example, you say, I'm trying to raise a child, and this is hard and discipline, and it seems like it's not good, and yet God gave a promise. God said the rod of correction will drive it far from him. God says it works. God says it works. Or maybe discipline, church discipline. I don't know if we can lead in that direction because I don't know if it works, and yet God says it works. And on down the line it goes. All right? Here's a third source of courage. The written word. The book of the law shall not depart out of your mouth. You should meditate on it day and night. You want courage? Put your nose in the book and read the book and study the book and meditate on the book, and you'll gain courage. We're not done. Number 4. Source of courage. Let's get ahead of ourselves. We haven't got there yet. But verse 17 and 18, the words of others. He had heard from God, be strong and of good courage. But now the children of Israel tell him to be strong and of good courage. Words from others is a source of encouragement. So not only did God say be strong and of good courage, but he gave him the keys to how to get that strength and to get that courage. Right here in the same context. All right, we're not ready for that. We're getting excited here. I know we're having fun. All right, let's go back to our outline now of chapter 1. That gets us through verse 9 now. Now, starting at verse 10, Joshua commissioned the people to get ready. So all we've accomplished in chapters 1, verses 1 to 9, God chose Joshua and says, and be strong and be of good courage. All right, now starting at verse 10, Joshua commanded the officers of the people to pass through the camp and tell the people to prepare provisions, for within 3 days we're going to cross over the Jordan to get the land that we're going to possess. Now let's stop there. And let's do, people often think the Bible is written in chronology to the point that whatever happened in chapter 1 happens before chapter 2. And that's not always the case. Because if that's the case, then they're getting ready to conquer the land before the spies go into the land, and the spies are going to be gone for more than 3 days, because remember, they hid for 3 days. Remember that? So that ain't going to work. So this, in verse 11, the 3-day order must have been given after the spies returned. After the spies have returned, the 3 days must be. Because when I get to the end of chapter 2, the spies come back and give a report. Joshua waited on the report, else why did they need to send the spies out if Joshua's not going to wait on the report? That while they're gone, he's sending men into battle. And they come back and say, well, faint-hearted. Well, it doesn't matter because I didn't send them in. No, that ain't going to work. So this is not true chronology. This was an order. He's just telling us what he did, and then we'll see what happened before that in chapter 2. Now notice at verse 12, the Reubenites and the Gadites and the half a tribe of Manasseh. That's those on the east side. Remember, there'd been a big discussion about them staying on that side, and Moses, God through Moses had told them they could stay, but they would have to go over and fight. But they could have that land. You can stay on this side of the river where they had conquered Sihon and Og. They can do that. And so verse 14, Joshua tells them, you and your little ones and your livestock shall remain here in the land in which Moses gave you on this side of Jordan, but you shall pass before your brethren armed with all your mighty men of valor and help them. In other words, you're going to go, the fighting men are going to go over and fight. Remember in the book of Numbers, the Numbers dealt with the fighting men. Not the total number of people, but the fighting men is what those numbers were. So when I'm not going to take the time to go back and trace the numbers for Gad and Manasseh, Reuben, Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh. But let's just footnote here to say that when we come to chapter 4, the total number of fighting men didn't go over. They didn't need to go over. Some needed to stay back and protect those that are on this side, the women and the children that are back over here on this side. And so 40,000 went across, and we'll get to that in chapter 4. We'll deal with all those numbers and the variation of those numbers in chapter 4. But anyway, that was his instruction. Now, at verse 15, until the Lord had given your brethren rest, as he has given you. And in other words, what he's saying in verses 15, verse 15, you're going to go over and you're going to fight till everybody's settled the land and all the fighting's done. Then you come back over on this side and you and your families enjoy the land. But you leave your family, your livestock all behind, and you fighting men go over and you're going to fight till it's done. That's what you're going to do. Now, how did they respond? All right, that's what we have in verses 16 to 18. So you're going to cross over in 3 days. Reuben, Gad, and half a tribe of Manasseh stay on the side, but fighting men go over. Now then, the people respond, and here's what they say. Every leader would love to have everybody respond in this manner. They answered, and Joshua said, as you have commanded us, we will do, and wherever you send, we'll go. You tell us we're going to go over, we're going to go over. You send us into battle, we'll go into battle. Just as we heeded Moses in all things, so we will heed you. Only your God be with you as he was with Moses. God's with you. God was with Moses. You're the leader. We respect you like we did Moses. And verse 18 is an interesting. Whoever rebels against your command and does not heed your words, and all that you command shall be put to death. In other words, we think we ought to be obedient, and anybody who's not obedient ought to be punished. So what you're telling us we're going to do. We'll go into battle, we'll go fight, and anyone who's not willing ought to be put to death. Now notice how they ended that. Only be strong and of good courage. They said the same thing God had said to Joshua. Joshua is telling them, God and Joshua is going to tell them to be strong and of good courage, and they turn around and tell Joshua to be strong and of good courage What I learned from verse 18 is encouragement is a two-way street. Sometimes you receive and sometimes you give. Sometimes you give back the encouragement that you just received. The encouragement was be strong and of good courage, and they said be strong and of good courage. Interesting, isn't it? All right, let's see if we got another question on chapter 1. Question number 5, what attitude did the people have when crossing over? We just went through verses 16 to 18. They said, we'll do what you command, and we'll go wherever you send. We'll do exactly what you say. Something along that line should be the right answer. Question number 3 was, what did God tell Joshua? To be strong and of good courage, to meditate and obey those same 4 things we just listed here a moment ago. All right, chapter 1 is Joshua prepares for the conquest. He's getting ready to go. God gets him ready, and he tries to get the people ready. That's all we've accomplished. All right, let's go further. Let's go on to chapter 2 now. In chapter 2, spies are sent to Jericho. Spies are sent to Jericho. That's chapter 2. 4 things happen in chapter 2. We're going to see the spies went to the house of Rahab, who hid him. Several questions are to be raised about that, as they often are among commentators. And Rahab states that she knows that God has given the land to Israel and begs for her life and her family's life. She spares their life by a cord, lets them down the side of the wall. And then the spies come back and report to Joshua. And that's the end of our study. All right, so let's go back to verses 1 to 7 now. The spies went to the house of Rahab, who hid. So Joshua the son of Nun sent out 2 men from Acacia Grove. Now let me bring up a map of Acacia Grove. Acacia Grove and Shittim, which is right here in this area right here. This is the tribe of Gad, and down here at the bottom is the Dead Sea. If you see a little bit of water there, and then that would be the Sea of Galilee, and this is the Jordan River. So that gives you kind of a bearing where we are. This was the middle tribe. Reuben is below that, and half the tribe of Manasseh is above it. Well, right at the bottom of that is Abel Shittim, also known as Acacia Grove. And that's where they are. And so he sends spies out from Acacia Grove, or Abel Shittim. Your footnote may say Shittim as the place where he sends them out. Go to the land, especially to Jericho. And so they went, and they came to the house of Rahab. It was a walled city with gates, the text tells us. They came to the house of a harlot named Rahab, and they lodged there. In other words, they stayed there. Now let's get through verse 7, and then we're going to raise some questions about her being a harlot. Why would they go to the house of a harlot? We're going to see her telling a lie. Did God approve of that? Why did she lie? Was that an encouragement? But let's get the story first. Verse 2, it was told the king, when the king took note of that, the king of a city, this is not a king of a nation, but often in Palestine or in Canaan there was kings of a city. This would be the king of that city. When he found out about that, he went and sent men to inquire of that, and behold, the men who come in here tonight of the children of Israel to search out our country. That was told to the king, and so he sent men and asked her, said, bring these men out. And the woman said, she took the 2 men and hid them. Now, where she hid them will be told in a moment. And she said, oh yeah, these men came. I'm reading at verse 4, but I don't know where they were from. And she's lying about that. She knew they were from Israel because she later tells them, I know about Israel. But I didn't know where they were from. And it happened that when the gate was shut, that the men went out of the gate just as it was being shut. And if y'all hurry, maybe you can pursue them and catch them before they reach the river. If y'all think they're from Israel, they're headed toward the Jordan, so maybe you can catch them before. So y'all hurry and get through the gate, and maybe you can catch them. But the footnote is, at verse 6, that she had brought them on the roof and hidden them under stalks of flax. That would be roofing. So she hid them under some roofing, and so perhaps some extra roofing, or maybe she pulled some up and put them under that. And so she hid them in a well-hidden place that even if they'd looked on the roof, they wouldn't have seen the men, perhaps. And so the men pursued them. According to verses 1 through 7, they went out and the gate was shut, and so they're going on their hunt for these men from Israel. Now, we'll talk about the deal they made in a moment, but let's go back over verses 1 to 7 and raise some questions. Let's start first with the lie. Several have raised questions about this, and it's been raised as a Bible contradiction that here's part of the Bible. God condemns lying, and yet God approved of lying here. God says lying is wrong, and yet he had Rahab lie. A couple of notes about the lying. There is no indication that God approved or caused her to lie. There's no evidence in this text or any other. Now, God can use even a person's sin for his good and for his cause. How so? Well, let's just take Babylon, for example, and coming in upon Judah later, much later than this period. They're a sinful nation. Or let's just start over. Let me erase that. That's a good illustration. But here's even a better. They killed Jesus. That was sinful to do. And yet God used their killing of Jesus to shed the blood for the salvation of mankind. Now, did God cause them to kill Jesus? No. No, God didn't cause that. Did he command them to? No, he didn't do that. Those wicked men, God held them accountable for that. But he used it for his purpose. And God did that here. Furthermore, there's no indication that the men asked her to lie, that the spies. And if they did, the Bible mentions this here with no approval. God gives no approval to that at all. Because all other passages mention lying and says it's wrong. So we all understand that. Let's go to another question about this in verses 1 through 7. Why go to the harlot's house? Several commentators come to this and said it was for immoral reasons. These men, they were spies, and yes, they were servants of Joshua, and they're going to spy out the land, but they went there for immoral purposes. Why else would you go to the house of a harlot? If so, and that maybe they did. There's no approval of God on that. There's no approval that God or Joshua or any other children of Israel approved and said, hey, that's great that you went and did that. It is more likely that they went to the house of a harlot because men coming and going at her house would be common. And they would draw less attention by going to her house than perhaps somewhere else. So that's the more likely reason why they may have gone. So men coming in, even strange men from out of the city coming in and going to the harlot's house would draw less attention. There's always men coming and going at that house. And perhaps that's the reason they went. Now, was she a harlot at the time? Well, she seems to have changed. And we'll talk about that here in just a moment. In fact, let's go to Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 31. She is mentioned as a great example of faith. By faith, the harlot Rahab did not perish with those who did not believe. She's mentioned as a great example of faith. She was a person of faith. Let's look at another reference about her. In James 2, in verse 25, mentions Rahab the harlot. Likewise, was not Rahab the harlot justified by works when she received the messengers? She's mentioned in a favorable way, not because she was a harlot, but because of her faith and the actions of her faith. And in Matthew chapter 1, in verse 5, she's in the lineage of Christ. She was part of the lineage of Christ. She must have changed and given up her harlotry. And evidence of that would be that the harlot was not to live. If she was spared and lived among the children of Israel, which she did, Deuteronomy 23 says, the harlot, beginning at verse 17, the harlot was to be killed. If she was a harlot and continued to practice her harlotry, she was not supposed to live among the people of God. All right, let's go further now. Let's notice beginning at verse 8 through 14, here's where we see her faith in God. We hadn't seen much faith. If we stop at verse 9, verse 7 rather, we haven't seen much faith on her part. But we do see some faith here, beginning at verse 8. So before they lay down for the night to sleep, because they were lodging there, she said to them, I know that the Lord has given you the land. Now, this is interesting. I know God has given you this land. And the terror of you, that is the children of Israel, have fallen on the inhabitants, and we are faint-hearted because of you. People on this side of the river over here have lost courage, and we're scared to death and we're terrorized thinking of the children of Israel coming our way. Well, why is that? All right, let's go further. For we heard how the Lord dried up the waters. She is acknowledging a miracle. That is at the Red Sea. Long before, this was back some years before, many years before, they crossed the Red Sea. We heard that story. That got over here to us, and we've been hearing about the story of crossing the Red Sea when you came out of Egypt and how you killed the two kings on the other side, Sihon and Og. We heard about it, and you utterly destroyed them. And our hearts melted, verse 11, and there doesn't remain any more courage within us. For the Lord your God, He is God in heaven above and on the earth beneath. We know your God is in control. We've heard about that. Notice the strong faith she has. Great faith she has. Then she says, now beginning at verse 12, she begs for the life of herself and her family. She said, swear to me to show kindness. In other words, I know you're coming. I know who you are. I know you're spies. I know the Lord has given you the land, and I know you're going to conquer the land. I know you're going to take the city, and you're going to conquer this city. Here's what I ask you to do. Swear to me, show me kindness, and the kindness to my father's house, and give me a true token. That is, give me a pledge. That indeed give me a promise. I want a promise that you're going to spare me. And in interest of time, I want to drop down to verse 15. Then she let them, she asked for the promise, and we'll get more to the promise in a moment. She let them down by a rope through a window, and she dwelt on the house that was on the city wall, and she dwelt on the wall. Now, let's talk about that house on the wall. This is from an archaeological site about ancient Jericho. There are varying views with reference to the house on the wall. Some have thought that there was a house, that the wall would be wide enough, the house would have been sitting literally on top of the wall, and perhaps it was. Some of the archaeologists are thinking, and I may can blow this up a little bit bigger, if I can get over there, that these houses in this region here, and I'm not sure exactly why, they think perhaps, I left that Rahab's house may have been back, I think it was on this side where some thought her house may have been. But anyway, you're getting the picture here of a house adjacent to the wall being there, and a house with a window perhaps right against the wall so that one could go out and be right on the top of the wall and go down. That may have been the kind of setting. Some of the archaeologists think perhaps that's the kind of situation. Others have thought there would have been a house exactly on the wall. That doesn't really matter to me. There was a house that says it was on the wall or against the wall nonetheless. Now, at verse 16, let's start at verse 16 now. And let's finish up the chapter in the time we've got left. Or at verse 15 through 21, she let them down, and the men said to her, we will be blameless of your oath of yours, which you've made us to swear. In other words, we swear to you that indeed we're going to spare your life. Now notice, and you might underline this word, unless. This is a good point and place to talk to someone about conditions of salvation. Unless you meet the conditions, you'll not be saved. Look at verse 18. Unless what? What are the conditions? When we come to the land, you bind this line, the scarlet cord in the window. That's condition number one. We're going to be blameless. In other words, if you and your household get killed, we're innocent unless you put the cord in the window. You've got to do that, number one. There's action on your part. By faith, she obeyed. Remember, Hebrews 11, James 2? Second condition. Look at verse 18. And unless you bring your father and your mother and your brothers and your sisters into your own house. So here's the deal. You got to put the scarlet cord out. And then secondly, you've got to have everybody that you want to spare in the house with you. Now, going to everybody else's house, they're going to be in the house. Now, there's some practical things to learn from that. Now notice, verse 19. So it shall be that whoever goes outside the doors of your house, his blood will be on his own head. There's a big risk in going outside the house. Because we might come and they won't be spared. Unless you're in the Lord's church and faithful, you can't be saved. There's a great risk when you go outside. You may want to come back in, and you may get to come back in, but the Lord may come while you're gone. What a practical thing to learn. There are conditions to being saved, and it was with reference to her. Now, let's see, our time is about gone. Let's quickly get to the end of this chapter and we'll be done. Now, verse 20, here was another thing they told her, do not tell this business of ours, and then you will be free of the oath. If you do not tell, and if you tell this business of ours, then we'll be free from the oath. And she said, according to your word, etc. And so she bound the scarlet cord. Now let's get down to verse 22 to 24. That's all been done. She tells them to go to the mountain and wait for 3 days so these men have got through searching for you, and then you go home. And so they do. So they departed the mountain, waited for 3 days, and till the pursuers came back. Verse 22, then verse 23, the two men returned from the mountain. They crossed over the river and they came to Joshua. And here's what they said to Joshua, verse 24. The Lord has delivered the land into our hands for the inhabitants, for indeed all the inhabitants of the country are faint-hearted because of us. In other words, the fear of God has already got into the hearts of these people, and God's going to give us this land. And so what do we have in chapter 2? Basically, the spies go to Jericho. They come back and say, hey, we've been over there. They're scared, and we're ready to go. And so we're going to see in chapters 3 and 4, they're getting ready for that. All right, chapters 3 and 4 next time. If you did not get questions, I think they're on the front pew for chapters 3 and 4.